Let me put it this way, we will at most go for a half hour. We don't necessarily have to do that. It's been a long day, and you've all been very good in terms of staying here. Not that the weather necessarily would have encouraged you to leave. Tom and Rita, if you can't see, it's a nor'easter going on here. Anyway, I think we'll start by Abe and Henry sort of, going over what they've learned from the conference in terms of sort of potentially pushing the project. And then I will talk about what I think potentially come of this, sort of separate from, like obviously related, but separate from their sort of fully fleshing out of this project. So I'll turn it over to you guys to start.
Shall I start? And I'm going to be pretty quick because a lot of what I was going to say got sort of effectively turned into that answer to that question. So I think that this is a really, really exciting moment for international political economy, which has not been a particularly exciting field for a long, long time. And one of the key questions I think for us is how we begin to think about this more systematically. And by this, as was indicated, this is not just weaponized interdependence pure. This is a wide variety of different questions, which you can think about them on two planes. So you can think about them as a nexus of issues around the relationship between political economy and security, all of the complicated things that are happening there, including indeed some of the institutional questions too, which Rita and other people were talking about. And one could also think about this is, I think, Charlie's contribution in terms of a broader set of questions about the role of networks in international politics. He is one of the people who has pioneered that, of course, but thinking in a much more systematic way about the consequences of positionality for resource flows and for influence, and how this creates a set of power dynamics that international relations scholars haven't paid nearly enough attention to. A variety of things that we need to do. And I think you can think about the research agenda, I think, in under three different tranches. One is an empirical tranche. And we need a huge, huge, huge exercise in data gathering. Know nearly enough about the world. And this is something which is a huge, huge. We're discovering that this stuff is important, and this stuff, the data is just not, in most cases it is not there, and where it is there, it's pretty fragmentary, and we need to start figuring this stuff out. And by this we, this is a broader we. I mean, this is not just the research community we. This is also governments are going to have to begin to figure this out. And part of the story that I think we are beginning to see unfolding about how it is that state capacities are increasing. Part of that story inevitably is going to involve a much, much more direct engagement in actually figuring out how the economy works, so that the kind of the useful fictions that we have had for a long period of time, that is, these ideas about globalization, and about trade and whatever, we're discovering that the world is a much, much more complex place than our fictions suggested. And in order to figure stuff out, we need to go out and we need to start building a proper understanding. Second, and this is, so this is research, but this is also very, very policy consequential. One of the key themes that I think has come up again and again, Tom spoke about this, and also Abe and I have been working independently. We're trying to write a piece for Foreign Affairs at the moment, which is setting out our ideas on this. We need to figure out rules of the road. So Abe yesterday said that in some ways this was basically 1945 again. You can also think about this as being a Cuban Missile Crisis moment, where the world, we're realizing that the world involves all of these intersections which can have dire consequences for everybody, and where we do not have a set of common concepts that would both allow us to understand and to communicate with each other. So we need to start building up that conceptual vocabulary. In a certain sense, this is a Thomas Schelling moment. So if you think about, so the reason why we haven't seen nearly as much of this in the past is because this has been primarily a US, not quite completely unilateral, but getting close to US unilateralism and its use of sort of the financial space in particular. And now we're beginning to see other countries building up their own capacities. We're beginning to see possible pushback, and this means that we get into all of the happy land of mutual errors escalation dynamics, all of the unpleasant stuff that went along with the Cold War. The good news is that there is no direct likelihood, at least, of nuclear conflagration as a result of mistakes being made. So in that sense, we're better off. The bad news is that this stuff is much, much more complicated than nuclear weapons. So in many ways, so nuclear weapons, they are a complex technology to build. But once you build them, you've got you can construct a fairly straightforward strategic understanding among the key groups of actors who are relatively small communities, senior military people and nuclear scientists. And then you can try to you can work out the modalities between the two. This is a far more complicated set of questions involving a much more varied group of people who need to come together. And here, it's not only political scientists, it's data scientists, it's commercial, commercial people, it's computer scientists. We need, and that Susan's talk yesterday, I thought was, earlier was, I thought very good in this. We need to bring these people, these different communities together. It's going to be far harder to do. Our results are going to be much more plausibly much more equivocal, but nonetheless, we need to do this. Final agenda here is that we need to think about what are the circumstances under which this stuff actually, under which the use of these tools, how did this affect the structures within which they are embedded? And this is, Abe and I have ideas about how it is that you can get these self-undermining institutions. This is one way of thinking about this. Another might be to think about this from the perspective of complexity theory, because networks effectively, they're structures that very often emerge as a partly intended, partly unintended consequence of the interactions of multitudes of actors in a set of, in a space which is basically constructed of these weakly connected big structures which interact in complex ways. Abe and I, in the Weaponized Interdependence article, we have a footnote, which is one of the ways in which you try to deal with questions which you simply can't deal with at length, is you throw in a footnote so that you then have some plausible deniability afterwards to say, well, we did kind of mention this, even if we didn't say anything very useful. So we have a footnote where we say so that this could be seen in some ways as being part of a new structuralism. And here we shout out to Thomas's work. We shout out Mark is gonna guess, but to his work with Matthias Matisse. There is a lot of work that we need to do in order to think more systematically and theoretically about this. And finally, and this is kind of looping back to the we need more, we need to know more about this. If we're to really think about what this means for the field of international political economy over the next 10 to 15 years, I think we are going to have to expand the discussion, and we are going to have a lot more direct engagement with the kinds of people, Abe and Dan and I, and the other people who are here, and other people in other, in other disciplines. So this is not only going to be a conversation that has to bring in national security and international political economy people, it also has to bring in economic sociologists. The people who are doing, I think, some of the most interesting work on the complex structures that we need to figure out are macro financial economists like Adam Tooze. So I think, in a certain sense, we want to think about reconstructing political economy. This is maybe a much broader agenda that could come from this and from many other projects kind of pushing the same way. We want to think about how to restructure political economy so that it better understands the dynamic politics of a global world which simply are not working in the ways that our traditional theories told us that they ought to be working. And that's a huge, huge agenda. And also, again, I mentioned, I think briefly, Natasha has a edited volume with a number of other people, which points back to the work of Susan Strange. Another of our footnotes, our sort of exculpatory footnotes, is basically Susan Strange is awesome, and if we had more time, we would tell you about how she fits into this. But that is another body of research which we need to start drawing on. And here, the work that Natasha and other people in information, in the politics of information, more broadly speaking, are doing is clearly directly and urgently relevant to these new conversations.
It's also in airplane mode, so I can't help you with that at the moment.
Siri, behave!
This Tupperware party has gone downhill. I won't say too much more. I think Henry said most of the things I wanted to say. I just wanted to start maybe just about, whenever you have a new concept, you want to promote it so that it's like, this is something you're proud of, this thing you think it's interesting, you want other people to get excited about it. But then, of course, then as Henry said earlier, that it can become everything. And so, I think part of the conversation can also be, as Tom mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of economic coercion in the world. This is just one slice of it. So a lot of my work previously was about market power. It was about limiting access to the consumer market of a large state like the United States. And China does this all the time. There are many instances where they're using economic coercion in order to force change. And so what we were trying to do in this piece was just to highlight that the network, not just your domestic market, but the network is a source of vulnerability, and that they can be deployed in this kind of strategic way. And so we want to open it up to have conversations about, well, what's the relative value of market power versus this more network-based power? There's other types of economic coercion that could be deployed. And so I think that can be a part of a larger conversation about, weaponized interdependence isn't everything, and we don't want it to say that it's everything. We kind of have a more kind of contained version of what that is. And there, I think it's really, we wanted to emphasize that the structure is asymmetrical and that produces state strategies that are unique than when the structure is more flat. The other point I just wanted to come back to is this, I think what Henry just mentioned about the rules of the road, but also what Amrita was suggesting about, like, is this a sad story or a happy story? And like, there's no doubt this is a less happy story than the Thomas Friedman story, which was like, win-win and everybody's loving this situation. But I think it's like, it's just, we have to become more comfortable with being a little uncomfortable. We had this like, we can have our cake and eat it too, and it was because everything seemed so, because we were in the seat of power and we made everybody play by our rules. But I think if you ask the Global South over the last 50 years, they would have seen that there was power being played out all along. And so this idea that like, we can't live with a little bit of security concerns in interdependence, that's why I'm less about we're going to have a total breakdown and decoupling in the global system. It's just we need to become comfortable with the fact that, there are vulnerabilities. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, he was saying the same thing, hundreds of years ago. So I'm more on the side of like, if we work with the policy community, come up with a set of rules of the road, ways that we can minimize the most vulnerable sectors, but maximize the places where, Ricardo still makes sense, I think that we're going to come to a viable option. But I think we really have to push back against the version of, we want a new Cold War where there's going to be no, economic exchange between the largest powers. I think that's a very radical, and people throw that around just because it's easy to say, but I don't think they can really envision. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep saying that over and over, the party's starting to move in that direction. So I think we have to work hard to come up with those rules of the road. And I'll turn it over to Dan.
Sure. So in terms of next steps, first of all, I realized as Abe was talking why I like this argument so much, because it finally resolves our disagreement, which is to say, whenever we've talked about coercion, I've always talked about market power, and you've always talked about the need for state institutions to actually exercise that power. And in some ways, this argument kind of sort of, splits the difference in some ways. It combines both of them. And so therefore, I realized that those accommodating instincts, I was like, oh, now Abe and I can work on the same thing. This is great. So I just realized that was one of the reasons why I suspect I like this. In terms of what, first of all, I want to thank everyone, both the participants, but also particularly the panelists, for bringing their A game in terms of genuinely reading and imbibing the paper and meditating on both the strengths and the weaknesses, and trying to sort of take those ideas, applying them to their own field of endeavor, and thinking about the ways in which these ideas can play with each other. In some ways, that's the best kind of conference as far as I'm concerned. The idea of this, and I wasn't completely locked in on this, is to potentially produce an edited volume, probably for Brookings Institution Press. As the academics in the room know, it's not like edited volumes are really a hot commodity right now. And when I brought this idea to Brookings, they fell all over themselves to make it clear they were extremely interested in doing something like this. And I think it's worth doing for a couple of reasons. In some ways linked to, but also somewhat separate from what Henry and Abe want to do. The first is, again, similar to what they're doing, is sort of just description in terms of what is this phenomenon and how, when are we witnessing it, when are we not. To that, Henry said something in the last panel about how if you come up with an idea, sometimes you lose authorship of it. I think one of the virtues of doing an edited volume in some ways, if I'm going to be grandiose, is that it could serve the same function as, let's say, Krasner's International Regimes did, which is that did lock down what that meant. That was actually relatively successful. And I think there is genuine value added in coming up with a volume that says, this is what weaponized interdependence is, and more importantly, this is what it is not. In order to prevent the kind of, widespread use of the word, of the term, because I have no doubt that Washington is going to jump up and down, really way too super eager to apply this to a lot of spheres where it doesn't. So, if we can simultaneously market the term, but also delimit where it applies, and for that matter, its potency, because clearly one of the takeaways I think from today was that there are places where it clearly applies. There are places where it applies, but it doesn't necessarily matter as much as you think, or it doesn't. The effects are not necessarily as great. So I think that's worthwhile to do. And then also the sort of obviously the policy implications and possible recommendations and debates. I don't think we have a settled sense of what we should do here. And I think there's genuinely, we are at a moment of like 45 or 46 when you actually had people like Kennan and Lippmann genuinely debating what should if we're in a bipolar world, what should the proper response be? And so I think in that sense that there's some definite value added to an edited volume. So in terms of sort of thinking about the issues that I'd want it to tackle, I could think of sort of three broad categories. The first would be scope conditions, which is to say, where does this apply, where does it not? Both in terms of sort of time, historically, have we seen this in the past? And, Henry named a reference to that we have probably seen this in the past. I think bringing in some historians to comment on that would be good. Also, the extent to which this is not necessarily going to stop. In some ways, and that was my Trump question. That was I didn't actually think the weaponized interdependence was going to stop, but in some ways, it confirms that this is going to be resilient despite even if there's like temporary overreach. Not just scope conditions for time, also scope conditions in terms of issue area. Where in which issues is this really powerful? Finance clearly seems to be one. The internet clearly seems to be one. And in what issues maybe is it not necessarily is applicable? Energy is an interesting, certainly example of that. Third, and this is related, I guess, is magnitude. In other words, even if you do see this, what is the punch that it actually carries? In other words, when are the conditions under which this will really, affect even relatively powerful states in terms of having to altering their behavior? And then finally, I think resilience. In other words, if weaponized interdependence is exercised again and again, does the network that enables that weaponized interdependence persist, or does it eventually lead to the kinds of reactions that Charlie and Amrita and others talked about that would lead to its own undoing? The second thing I think is interesting, and again, maybe this is just me, but is genuinely the perception and misperception on these sorts of things. The degree to which weaponized interdependence in part happens because actors misperceive when these things are actually going to occur. And so they don't recognize the very networks that they're creating. And so there are clearly instances in which they underestimate when they might, be leading themselves to be vulnerable to these kinds of network effects. So I think biases in which they over-exaggerate sorts of networks. And I think the energy and transit panel sort of made that clear. And I think that would be interesting. In some ways, this goes to the fundamental attribution error that Henry wrote. And then finally, and this is sort of related to the policy implications, but what can institutions do dealing with this, both sort of enabling and disabling institutions? In other words, institutions that enable, actors to actually use weaponized interdependence, and are there disabling institutions that essentially prevent actors from doing this even if they want to? And are there ways in which actors can credibly commit not to do this if the cost, even if the action might lead to a sort of short-term gain, but in the long term winds up leading to significant disruption. But in terms of sort of next steps, what I will ask of the people that are still here, and I'll send an email to this effect as well, is that for those of you who wrote memos, obviously, if you want to turn those into chapters, we're looking at things like 5,000 word chapters, basically. But if you haven't done one, to basically let me know whether you're interested in doing so. And in terms of sort of time frame, I think we're talking about sometime in the next 6 months, whether you could write something along those lines. to get into, you know, and then, you know, then obviously doing the publication process of getting it into Brookings feedback. And by the way, when I say, let me know, I'm not just talking about the panelists that presented, but also the chairs. Some of them, you know, had some interesting ideas. And I'm, you know, perfectly be happy to hear feedback on that. Any thoughts from?
So just on the general point you guys made about this, you know, Schelling-esque moment, I actually think, not only for this, but it's so true in so many ways of IR broadly. Right? And if you think about, you know, what happened in that period, mid-40s on, you know, theories of nuclear deterrence, you know, and all aspects of Brody, Schelling, et cetera. And so, and I actually tell this to my grad students a lot, that for a lot of years we sort of debated, we kind of knew what the questions were, Cold War and everything, we debated what the answers were. I actually think what's really interesting intellectually about this period is debating what the questions are. And so I think this, and absolutely what this is and what isn't within that is very important. Right? So I think that's a great motivation, and there should be others going on like that. Is how would you want to structure this, you know, as like sort of a structured, focused comparison of case studies with an agreed upon framework, or whether it's by issue area or by topics? I mean, what you're thinking about how you would structure so it holds together as a volume?
Yeah,
all of you all have different views. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of my, you know, in terms of the edited volume, I don't necessarily, I don't know if, you know, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of structured focus comparison. I would obviously want, I mean, we have people who know finance and can write about that. We have people who, you know, internet can write about that. In some ways, it would be easy for me if I'm writing an introduction to sort of use them as to sort of talk about structured focus comparison way. Again, we're aiming here as much for a policy audience as we are for an academic one. So, which is not to say, like, you know, the moment I use structured focus comparison, I've lost half the audience. So in that sense, no. But the way I'm thinking about it is that literally it's feeling the elephant, right? You know, you know, I think the one thing that Henry and Abe's paper does is tell us there's an elephant out there. We have no idea what the size of it is. We have no idea which direction it's going. We still don't know which side of the elephant we're touching. And so in some ways, I think, I guess I'm less ambitious in terms of what I would want this volume to do.
And again, so if you guys, is whether or not you'd want to, you know, part of that 5,000 words be empirical, analytic, but for each one of those, you know, have a part of that that draws out policy implications and see what that looks like as you guys try to weave it together.
We could discuss, but I don't think it's a bad idea to have like a template.
Yeah.
That is like, everybody try to address these 4 things, you know, like, you know, what is weaponized, or what does the network look like in your case? What are the strategies that actors are using? You know, are they successful, not successful? You know, like, I think to have like a list of things that everybody tries to answer those questions, if people are willing. I mean, it's always you're herding cats and you don't want to make people, but I think in a volume like this where you're trying to like define the elephant, if you have a schema that everybody is riffing on, and I kind of think everybody would probably be willing to do that because you don't have papers, you're not coming with this with your weaponized interdependence paper already in hand. So,
and by the way, just to be clear, I'm not for, you know, if you don't want to do this, you certainly don't have to. As I said, I you know, the idea of this was I wanted to see if there was enough there to justify a volume. I think there's enough there, but you know, but I like the idea of a sort of, I think for the, particularly for the empirical chapters, I think that there's absolutely sufficient template. And actually, yeah, come to think about it, it would work for the historical chapters as well. I think, yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, all right.
who's buying?
I will want to see the template.
Oh, God, yes. No, we're not. No, we're going to make you write it, and then we're going to give you the template.
No, but I mean, it's one thing to turn the memo I wrote into a paper. That would be easy. I'm prepared. It's not really what you're looking for, because everybody came with their own different theoretical. What you want to do is consolidate into a framing chapter and then impose.
No, because I think
frame on people to do empirics. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I think, so let me put it this way. I think your panel, I don't think would fit into that template in the same way. Because you're focusing on a different set of actors. So in other words, like I think that template works if you're writing a chapter on finance or a chapter on the internet or a chapter on cold networks in world, during the First World War.
Shouldn't the whole point be that whatever you guys decide this thing means, and I really liked the point, Dan, about locking the concept. So that, a powerful actor can't stretch it to their liking in different ways. Isn't the idea that it should then be either travel to my area or not? Right? Whether it's gonna
But
be
I
something
also,
that
I
only
also think it's
works.
totally fine, in my mind, to have people that say it's not traveling, or I would do it differently.
Right.
This isn't, I
No,
disagree with this framework.
Right, to be clear, I actually think I want some chapters in there, and I think this came out in the discussion on BRI. I want a chapter in there on the BRI that just says, yeah, weaponized interdependence is a thing. Does it apply to BRI? At best weekly, and probably not. That in and of itself, by the way, given the climate in Washington right now,
It's hugely helpful.
would be hugely helpful. So it's, in other words, to be perfectly clear, I think because the concept is so exciting, there is value in null hypotheses chapters, if that makes sense. In other words, there's value in a chapter saying it doesn't work here and here's why. Because in some ways, I think that's actually, it demonstrates, again, the scope condition. So I don't have a problem with that at all.
And also it doesn't work in this area, but something similar works. And here's how that thing is similar, and here's how it is different. That also, I think, is really helpful in just, sort of turning it, making sure that this doesn't just become a kind of one size fits all kind of thing.
Exactly.
And sort of also getting back to the debate about securitizing from the last panel, there's one of the worries about weaponized interdependence. You're saying that this is about weaponizing, and I guess this gets back to your comment as well in some ways. And thinking about the world as being full of all this weaponized stuff can be problematic when some of the stuff isn't really being weaponized, but may actually be weaponized after you start to create these kinds of dynamics of mutual distrust and security spirals, bad stuff that we know about.
Maybe something to emphasize in the book. This is not a policy buzzword you're actually trying to create. It's simply an analytical framework.
Certainly want to emphasize in the edited volume.
Yeah.
Speak to Henry for Henry.
Yeah.
I do fear that it has become a very securitized
Right.
way of thinking about just relations of power that have always been part of interdependence in ways that may power certain actors in ways that might do that.
Again, that would be a great chapter. I mean, that would be would be, because I think what we want here is stuff that will, it will feed back into the academic debate, but stuff that will make sure that the policy debate doesn't take this up in ways that policy actors, treat academic.
I don't want weaponized interdependence weaponized.
Exactly.
Yes.
Don't weaponize my weaponized.
Exactly. No, but I mean, more seriously, like, think about, in terms of edited volumes, think about like Krasner's chapter in the Cohen and Goldstein volume on ideas in foreign policy, where that was a specifically contrarian chapter pointing out, look, there are limits on these ideas, on what you're talking about here. So I think particularly in this kind of concept that there's definite validity in doing that.
Yeah.
Also, people that be critics, you included that,
Right.
Yeah.
which is recognition
Yeah.
of it. So,
Exactly. Hereby declare this conference over by the power vested in me. First, a generous round of applause to Art Gorkowski for organizing everything. Brad, because that was easily the best tech I have ever seen in terms of people remotely contributing. And I believe there's alcohol right outside, so help
And to
yourself.
Dan for making us all happy.
And safe travels to everyone.